It's time for The Story Behind the Person, featuring lively, in-depth conversation with compelling guests from our community. And here is our host, Jonathan van Bilsen.
Hello and welcome to this episode. My guest today is Lucy Black, a Canada-based writer and educator. The stories of the young people whom she's worked with have shaped her professional life as well as that of her storytelling. I'm really looking forward to learning more about this accomplished writer. We'll be right back after these messages.
Top care with top stylists. Book your next hair appointment with Port Perry's award-winning hair salon, Rosario Greco Styles. The hair experience you deserve. Book today. Call 905-985-0099.
Welcome back. As I mentioned, my guest today is Lucy Black, an educator and an author. Lucy, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I've got a bunch of books here, and we're going to get into those. Before we do, the show is called The Story Behind a Person, so we want to get to know you a little bit. So you have been in Port Perry for 30-some-odd years in the area, and that, obviously, you like it here. Are you from the Toronto area originally, or?
Oh, I grew up in Willowdale.
Okay. Now, that's interesting. So did I.
Yes, I know. I think we both talked about going to the Willow Theatre.
That's right.
When we were young.
Oh my gosh, we could have a whole show just on that.
That's right.
In fact, there's a show, there's a Facebook page. It's called Willowdale of the 1970s or something like that.
Yes.
And so when we were both like 10 or 12 years old, we'll just go with that too.
Okay.
So you were a teacher.
Yes.
And you started life as, actually before you were a teacher, you said you were in marketing, or in
Training,
thank you.
I was a corporate trainer, yes. When I finished my degree at university, companies came onto campus and they were recruiting graduates. And so I was hired into a management training program with Sears Canada. And then they eventually streamed me into corporate training. And I went from working as an assistant trainer at Sears to the head of training for all of Ontario for Burke's Canada.
Oh.
And then I transitioned from that into teaching at Port Perry High School.
Wow, that's quite a switch. I mean,
yes.
Now Sears, was that still down on Mutual Street?
Yes, it was. 222 Jarvis Street.
I remember that.
In that sort of ziggurat building.
Yes, yeah, which is gone now, right?
No, it's still there.
Is it still there? It's been totally repositioned and it's no longer the retail business, right?
No, I don't know what
I don't either.
What occupies it, but it is still there.
Things do change. And Burke's, the move into Burke's was not affiliated with Sears, right? It was just a different position that came up.
That's right. It was another opportunity.
Wow, it's funny where life leads us, right? Because and I always say that, when you go to school, you're really too young to know what you're going to do the rest of your life.
Absolutely.
And I still haven't figured out what I'm going to do yet. I know that working is not part of the equation because I'm not big on that, but I still don't know where I'm going to end up. So to go into teaching, now, did you have to go to teacher's college at that time, or had you already done part of that before?
I worked for Sears, and then I left Sears. I went to teacher's college. Did my master's degree at the same time, and then took the position with Burke's. Okay.
So you would have been living in Toronto at that time, or at least not in Port Perry necessarily.
No, we were living in Richmond Hill.
Okay.
Which was a fairly easy commute.
And how does one end up in Port Perry from Richmond Hill? Because most people in Richmond Hill don't know where Port Perry is, right?
Well, Burke's was going through this transition where the brothers were splitting up the company.
Okay.
And I just decided that the environment wasn't as pleasant as it had been.
Right.
And one of the things they'd done was they broke off the silver factory, which was a huge, huge product line for the company. So I thought, well, I've got a teaching degree. Maybe I should try teaching for a year. Right. And I applied for a number of jobs. Durham was doing mass hiring at the time. And I was offered a job at Port Perry High School, and I thought, I'm going to try this for a year.
Wow.
And just fell in love with the community, fell in love with the kids, fell in love with the classroom.
Yeah.
And we stayed. We made a life here.
That's great. And your husband was a teacher as well, right?
Yes.
So, but he wasn't teaching in Port Perry? Or was
he was teaching in York Region in King City.
Okay. And I can imagine teaching has changed a lot between now and back then, right? Like just
Very much so.
Yeah, to the point where it's scary from my perspective, from what I hear. I mean, the love of the children is still there, and the love of educating them is still there, but the environment has changed.
Teaching is a privilege.
Yeah.
And I think that if you keep that foremost in your heart,
Right.
The other things don't matter so much.
Yeah.
You get to touch lives.
It's a good attitude. It's good. That's why I spent 6 years in grade 9. Just because I was privileged. So now, obviously you stayed with teaching, so you must have enjoyed it, but that first year when you were sort of doing it, when you weren't sure what you were going to do with the rest of your life, was that a culture shock? You're moving into a small town, you're in a career that you've never been in before, and you've got people that you don't know, you've got a whole job you don't know. Was that a shock?
I just fell in love with the kids, with the community. The staff was very warm and supportive. I'll tell you a story though. My husband and I bought our first house, and it was in North Nestleton Station, and we bought it on a Saturday morning, and we told no one. We hadn't told our parents. The only people that knew were the real estate agent and our lawyer. And I was teaching a class on Monday, and Monday afternoon, a whole group of girls came to my desk and said, "Mrs. Black, we have a question for you." And I said, "Yes." "Well, we know that you bought a house, and our mothers would like to know where you'll be attending church." So how they found out that we had bought this house, I still have no idea.
There are no secrets in this town. None whatsoever.
No, but the speculation was taking place as to where we were going to be going to church.
And that's a tough question because you're going to upset a few people one way or another, right?
Well, I was a little flabbergasted, to tell you the truth.
Wow, that is amazing because, I mean, you can't walk down the street without somebody commenting or saying something to you or something because, you're very visible. Like, you've been involved in many things. So it's a small town, and which is part of the charm too, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And,
you're not invisible.
No, totally not.
That's a real privilege.
Yeah, it is. So what did you teach? What subjects did you teach primarily?
When I was at the high school, I taught English and business and co-op.
Okay. So hence the English, and we're going to get into writing in a few minutes because that's I love your books and you write them very well.
Thank you.
As you know, I've written a few and it's a struggle for me, and it seems to come natural. And I do have a few questions about that. But when you were finished teaching, or as you were teaching, you decided to become a vice principal and then a principal, correct?
Yeah, people sort of decided that for me, to tell you the truth. Yeah, you get tapped on the shoulder and asked to apply for things as you go along the way. So the first thing, when I left Port Perry, I became a facilitator in South Oshawa for unemployed adults, and it was an employability skills program. And I was working essentially with a lot of hookers.
Really?
Yeah, they were aging out. And
this is in Oshawa, because we don't have that in Port Perry.
Yeah, it was South Oshawa. So, I do things like help them write their resume, and they were working in the entertainment industry. They were self-employed, and they were self-starters.
It's an interesting twist on the resume.
Yes. So, but it was really, really meaningful work. The Durham District School Board partnered with HRDC, and
HRDC,
Human Resources Development Canada. We were able to get them their employers hiring subsidies and help place these people into careers.
That is something that I've never run across that end of it at all. That's the first time I've ever heard of. And I mean, it makes perfect sense because these are people who obviously have issues. They wouldn't be in the position they're in if they didn't have issues. And then to try and get out of that is very commendable for them to want to do it, and then for someone like you to actually help them bridge into that.
Well, the school board was very innovative. Yeah. Wow.
That's, I did not expect that. That's interesting. And then from there, where did you?
Then I was invited to apply to become a vice principal. And I worked as a vice principal for 9 years.
In South Oshawa?
At J.L. Roberts in South Oshawa and at Henry Street High School in Whitby.
Okay.
And after that period of time, I was appointed principal at Uxbridge Secondary School.
Okay.
And was there for 4 years. And then Brock High School in Cannington for another 4 years.
Wow. Okay. That's, I mean, Cannington's quite a hike for considering that, everything else is relatively close, but good for you. We actually met, you may not remember, we met about 22 years ago when I was taking piano lessons.
That's right, and so was my son.
And so was your son.
I absolutely remember.
I remember that it was 2 doors down from where the studio was.
Yes,
Here it was Jason Cowens. Debbie Benson was the teacher.
That's right.
And because I used to go from 6 until 6:30, and when I came out, you and your husband and your son would be there because your son was taking lessons. And I remember a couple of times when I listened to him play, it was kind of enough to put me off the piano totally for me. But is he still taking that? Is he still doing that?
No, he's set that aside for now.
Is that right? Yeah, I've just pretty well mastered Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star now. I've got that down to a science and
good for you.
And so forth. But that's going back a few years. And we mentioned Debbie Benson. There was a fellow who was playing guitar at a restaurant here about maybe 8-9 years ago, and I forget his first name. His last name was Parrott. And he was actually married to Debbie Benson. And she resurfaced, and I saw her again. So we're just going to have this little chat amongst ourselves here. We'll just, forget the rest of the show. All right, so bringing it back. So you decided that teaching was enough. You'd had enough. You were at that age where you could take advantage of it and do something different. Is that when you started writing, or did you write all your life, sort of thing?
I've written all my life.
Have you?
I wrote my first novel when I was in grade 2.
Is that right?
It was a detective novel called The Great Mumbo.
Instead of Columbo, it was Great Mumbo.
Mumbo. But I had a wonderful teacher, and Miss Lee, and she had me read this novel to the class. Right. And they laughed, and they clapped, and they enjoyed it.
Really?
And I was hooked.
That's great.
I was
That's
hooked.
Awesome. So where's that book now? I don't see it in this group of books.
It's in a box.
Is
it's
it?
in a box.
Are you going to bring it out someday and resurface it?
Probably not.
Yeah.
It might be a bit embarrassing.
I wrote my first one when I was 16, I think, and I did it to learn to speak English properly. That's why I wrote, because I'd write a couple of words and I have to look them up in the dictionary to see what word meant, sort of thing. And
yes.
And it turned out to be foolscap, about 2,000 pages. So it never went anywhere. Yeah, it's far too much. It's just gibberish. But it's interesting how we start. And then you got into actually publishing a book, right? Your first book, which your first one was this one, correct?
My first one was the short story collection.
Right.
It was published.
Marzipan Fruit Basket.
Yeah.
And the name comes from?
It comes from one of the short stories, actually. Okay. And in the short story, actually, you would appreciate this. A little girl is taken to Holland with her mother.
Oh, that's nice.
Her mother is a new Canadian, and she's homesick. And she takes her young daughter to Holland, and they stay there for almost 6 months. And the mother's trying to figure out whether or not she wants to go back to Holland and restart her life there or not.
Right.
And on one of their train journeys, the little girl is given a marzipan fruit basket.
Ah, okay. Interesting.
And so,
I mean, Dutch and marzipan. It's. I'm gonna stop you for a sec because we're gonna take a break.
Yes.
And then when we come back, we're gonna learn all about these books and what got you into writing.
Okay.
So
thank
please
you.
Stay tuned. We'll be back right after these messages.
PP Print is excited to offer Port Perry wearables, featuring 2 great designs. Show your Scugog pride with apparel and headwear. We have you covered. PP Print, more than just print.
At Voss, your independent grocer, it's all about hometown living and shopping. Owned and operated by Terry and Christine Voss, their newly renovated Port Perry store carries many local items to support our town and its residents.
Welcome back. Our guest today is Lucy Black, an educator and author. Lucy, welcome back.
Thank you.
So we talked a little bit about you. We talked a lot about your life, which was very, very interesting. Some things that I had no idea, which was kind of cool. I want to talk about your books and the concept of writing books, because everybody I talk to wants to write a book, and everybody's got a book in them. But people won't sit down and do it. That's sort of the key, right, between people who do. So you've got a slew of them here. The very first one you did, we talked about briefly. It's a collection of short stories. It's called The Marzipan Fruit Basket. You've written all these stories yourself, I take it, over time?
Yes.
And did you just decide to compile them into a book?
Many of the stories in that collection were published in journals and magazines.
Right.
And a number of people spoke to me and said that I should put them together into a collection. And I realized that they had a unifying theme. They were all stories about women, and they were all stories about women going through a major life change or dislocation in terms of losing a partner or becoming a new Canadian.
Right.
Major changes in their lives. So I sent them to Inanna Publications, which is a feminist press out of York University, and they accepted it right away.
Wonderful.
So I was very fortunate.
Yeah, it's great. Short stories are always great too, because you can read them without dedicating a lot of time. Like, if you're going to read a book, you have to have the time set aside to be able to read the book.
Right.
And short stories allows you to do that on the fly, sort of thing.
Snatches.
Yeah, if you're traveling and something like that. And then the next one you wrote was this one, Eleanor Courtown, right?
Yes.
And I remember we did a joint presentation at the library, and you were promoting this book at the time, right?
Yes, that's right.
And so this is about a lady, if I'm not mistaken, it's been a while, but it's a lady who leaves Ireland rather, comes to Canada.
Yes.
And struggles to find a life here, correct?
Yes, it's based on a true story of a poisoning in Blackstock, Ontario. Okay. And we lived on a farm there. And I heard a story from a local farmer who told me this true story of a poisoning. I won't tell you the story now. But it was a wonderful piece of local history.
Right.
And so I did quite a bit of research and turned it into this historical fiction novel.
Well, the research is half the fun, right? If not more than half the fun.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because the writing is the tedious part, because you're doing that somewhere alone, but the research, digging into it. I also find with a lot of history, it's not exactly the way it really happened. It gets embellished a lot over time, right? And it becomes very, very colorful and so forth. And you've put it into a book. And this was, 4 years ago?
2017.
2017, so that's, 5 years ago. And it's a great book. We'll put these up on the screen along with the place. You can buy them, Books Galore. You can buy them at Blue Heron, on Amazon as well, correct? And so
correct,
forth?
Yes.
And now for Scugog Arts, you're doing a lot of writing courses, teaching people how to write.
Yes.
Because I'm sure a lot of people think, I could write a book, give me a pen, away we go. Which is not exactly the case. Characterization is very difficult. It's very difficult to build a book.
Well, people are interesting, and everybody has a million stories.
Right.
And I think a lot of those stories are worth documenting. Maybe not to write and publish a book, but maybe to share family history with children. And so I really encourage people to document those stories, and I like to think that I give them some tools that help them to do that. And Scugog Arts is just a wonderful local facility for supporting all sorts of arts endeavors. So
absolutely.
I'm very happy to be associated with them.
So are you finding people are very receptive to this now? Are you getting a good following with your courses?
I really am, actually, and it's quite fun to discover these burgeoning writers with wonderful stories,
right?
And a real passion for sharing those things that are important to them and documenting them for their family members in particular. So it's been great fun.
Yeah, it's a challenge, and it's interesting. I did a trip with my father back when he was about 84. We went back to Netherlands, and we ended up going to Germany. He was in a camp for 2 years in Germany, and we drove to that place, and it was the first time that he actually started talking about it and opened up. And I tried to document as much as I can, but there's a whole side that you just don't know about people. And unfortunately, when these people pass away, so do the stories with them, right? So it's important.
Well, that's right. And that's why I think writing is so important. And for me in my life, writing is about bearing witness to those important stories.
So this is called Thoughts on Writing. Now, is this something that people can purchase somewhere, or is it strictly with your course? They can?
Yes, it's available for purchase at Scugog Arts. And the Pine Ridge Arts Council and Scugog Arts asked me to pull something together that was accessible for people who decided they wanted to take up writing. So it's a whole series of little tiny blog posts or essays on the elements of writing.
Wow, this is interesting. It's great. It's great to have that sort of a guide to how to write. You still have to have the creative element. You still have to have the story within you before you can put it out. And I find so many people are great at telling you a story, and yet you tell them to write it down, they don't know where to begin. So it's the mechanics of it that's very important. So your newest book, Stella's Carpet,
yes,
which is a fantastic novel. If you have not read this, I highly recommend it. You get out and buy one. It is a great book. I've got 100 questions about it. So the storyline is about a young lady who's, and there's many characters. Her parents, her father is very much into carpets from, I assume, Middle East, that type of thing, those type of carpets. And consequently, she has taken up the interest in that. And then her mother, her parents are divorced. Her mother is sort of a different person, very selfish, very into herself, which becomes high maintenance. And their father remarries and has a new family. And then there's the grandparents, who to me are the real glue to this whole book. And I might be reading that wrong, but that's how I took it. So where does a story like that come from?
Well, the grandparents are the Lipinskis, and they're Polish newcomers. And grandfather Lipinski was captured by the Russians when Russia invaded Poland a week after Germany had invaded on the other side. And he was taken to a work camp in Siberia. He was there for a number of years and then escaped. And when he escaped, he joined the British forces, was sent to Scotland for officer training, and then was sent to Holland with a whole Polish delegation, and they pushed back against the German occupation. Grandmother Lipinski was in the novel. She was a Pole, and she was a Jew, and was sent to Theresienstadt, which was sort of the famous show camp that the Nazis ran, to try to fool the Red Cross into believing that the conditions at the camp were humane.
And all camps were like that in their eyes.
So the Lipinskis ended up coming to Canada. They settled in the High Park area and had a family. And both of them were very damaged as a result of their war experiences. And that damage impacted their daughter. And also had some impact on their granddaughter. And that's the concept known as intergenerational trauma. And that's something that I wanted to explore in the novel. All of Grandfather Lipinski's stories are my father's own war stories.
Okay. I wondered about that, because the way that you write it, it's not something that you made up. You can tell it's got a base somewhere. It has a base somewhere. Which is very interesting. I also found it interesting that the son-in-law becomes closer to the grandparents than the daughter does.
Yes, absolutely.
Which is interesting. And I'm not going to ask if that's I'm not going to go there. But when you build these characters, when you take a character, so let's say the daughter, for example, the granddaughter, for example, do you fashion it after someone you know? Or do you just build a character?
I think that Stella, who's the teacher, is a composite of different aspects of different people that I have interacted with over the years. I mean, writers write what they know. I was an educator. Stella is a teacher.
Of course.
The school that Stella teaches in is modeled on a composite of Uxbridge Secondary and Port Perry High School. People who work in those schools will recognize a lot of the details.
And what about Stella's friend? Do we know who that is? Forget her name, Tara?
Yes. No, not.
I thought you were going to throw out somebody's name that we all know in Port.
Yeah, no, not really, not in particular. So they're not really based on an individual, but she has a lot of my life experiences in this instance because she is a teacher. So I just draw on things from people that I have met.
What about the carpets?
The carpets. Well, my mother is not Grandmother Lipinski. My mother was Dutch. And her family, her father, worked for the resistance movement, and they helped to smuggle Jews through their home. And she and my aunt were quite terrified. And as you likely know, many of the Catholic priests were complicit with the Nazis. And so people would go to confession, and the priests would ask them all kinds of probing questions. And the next thing you know, their doors being kicked in. So my mother and my aunt lived with a great deal of fear during those years. But I used that fear for Maria Lipinski. But I made Maria Polish because I wanted to highlight the horrific atrocities that were visited upon the women by the Russian soldiers during the invasion of Poland.
And that stuff goes undocumented in a lot of cases, right? It's just never brought up because it's sensitive and we don't want to hear about that sort of thing.
Absolutely, absolutely. And actually, President Putin has made it illegal to talk about Russian involvement in the Second World War.
Wow.
It's a journalist or an academic who begins to write about any of these atrocities is imprisoned for up to 14 years and all of their assets seized.
Oh my gosh.
So you know that they know there's a shameful history there. But that's why Maria was Polish. And
well, the story certainly is amazing. Unfortunately, we're out of time.
Gosh.
It always goes quickly, especially when it's an interesting subject such as this. I would recommend anybody get this book, Stella's Carpet. It's well worth the read. It's not going to take long. And I wanted to ask you why you don't use quotation marks in your verbiage when you're talking about people, when people are speaking, and use italics, which is interesting. So perhaps we can get into that. We can have you back on your next book.
Okay, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your time, and thanks for being here. It was very interesting sharing your story with us. And thank you all for joining us as well. Please watch us every month right here on Rogers TV for the story behind the person.